This is Dr. Rich Shuttler with part 5 of 5 on presenting qualitative data in Chapter 4. This lesson is titled Wrap Up on Presenting Qualitative Data in Chapter 4. As you can see by the lesson strategy, this is lesson 7 of 12. After this lesson, 3 lessons will be provided based on presenting quantitative data. Then in lesson 11, there'll be a lesson specifically designed to help you better understand how to write the introduction and conclusion sections to your Chapter 4. Then lesson 12 will be a chapter wrap-up lesson that will highlight all the important points that you need to keep in mind as you write your own chapter. In this lesson, I will address 14 reminders for presenting qualitative data. Now, most of this information was in the prior 4 lessons, but these are what I call the most important items to make sure you keep in mind, perhaps as a checklist. So therefore, I encourage you to write these items down on a piece of paper and then use them later as you write your chapter, or once your chapter is done, to use as perhaps a checklist to make sure all the important information is included and perhaps in the right order as well. Of course, you have this video so you can replay it any time as well. And then I'll conclude this lesson with a reflective summary. Let's get right into the 14 reminders for presenting qualitative data. The first one is explain how the data was collected. Keep in mind that while you have information in Chapter 3 based on your data collection plan, in Chapter 4 there's certain information you want to provide, not at the same level of depth, but so the reader who does not read the other chapters in your work will have a general understanding of how the data was collected. While your university reviewers and of course your dissertation committee members will have read your entire dissertation, keep in mind that years from now when people go to download and read your dissertation, they may only want to read Chapter 4. And that's why we like to make sure that all the chapters in a dissertation have enough what we call standalone information. So if somebody read your Chapter 4 in regards to your data being presented, they'll have enough information just by reading that chapter alone. Perhaps they may read other chapters, but that's not always the case. So let's help the reader understand how your data was collected. Did you interview all the people? If you did you do that through face-to-face interviews, or were perhaps some of them done on the phone or Skype? How was the data actually collected from the interview process? In qualitative data, more times than not, the researchers are interviewing the interviewees. Now, you may have somebody else do the interviews for you. That's not uncommon. It happens from time to time. Was somebody else in the room with you that maybe perhaps ran your digital recorder so that you didn't have to deal with that or take notes or observations? Just help the reader understand, perhaps in a paragraph, maybe 2 at the most, of how the data was collected. Then, in another paragraph or 2, explain how the data was processed. Did you use a software program, perhaps like In Vivo software or Atlas, to put your transcript into and then take out from that software the themes and nodes that were generated by the computer's program? Or did you do it manually? Or did somebody else process this data for you? It's not unheard of that somebody else will run your data for you. That's okay. In most universities, that's allowed. But you still have to understand how everything happened and, of course, what the meaning is behind the outcome of the data that produced information. Again, much like the prior slide, explain how the data was processed so those people who do not read your Chapter 3 will have a general understanding of how you process the data. In Chapter 4, explain how data is being presented. What I encourage you to do is help the reader understand from this point in Chapter 4, which is early in the chapter, how the rest of the chapter will flow. Are you presenting the qualitative data based by themes that were generated by prioritization, based on which ones are more commonly referred to? Or perhaps is your chapter designed by research questions? And then in the individual research questions, you give the themes for each research questions, and then perhaps at the end you give the overall themes. There are many different ways that you can design Chapter 4. based on a conversation with your dissertation chair and perhaps your committee members, or may be provided to you in a script or a handbook on how you should present your chapter 4. Just help the reader to understand what's coming. Remember, we want the reader to understand enough information in your chapter 4 so that once they get into the data being presented, they have an understanding of how it's going to unfold for them as they read your story. Explain how themes are prioritized. As I mentioned on the last slide, often authors of a dissertation will present their chapter 4 based on the themes that were generated from the interviews. How are your themes being presented? Are they being presented because out of perhaps 10 themes that were generated, the first theme that you're going to relate to had perhaps 16 of 18 people that related to something, and theme number 2 had perhaps 13 of 18 people, and theme number 3 maybe 10 of 18 people, and they're prioritized based by frequency. It's not uncommon, though, for an author of a dissertation to take a theme that was not expected and write about that theme first, because perhaps that's the one thing that nobody else found in their dissertation. Again, this would be something you would decide with your dissertation chair and decide what's best for your design. But whatever your process is, make sure that you give the reader some sort of an explanation on how your themes are being prioritized in your presentation. I encourage you to stay consistent in design. What I mean by that is however you're going to generate one theme, generate it consistently in the same format or design as the first one is. What I like to see is the first theme with a little bit of a narrative. And then if a table or figure is needed, perhaps add that in there. And then some quoting from the people that were interviewed to substantiate that theme. Now in your design, if you decide that you're going to use your design based on the research questions, again, if you have 2 or more research questions, make sure the design for one research question is the same for the other research questions. For example, don't put quotes in before the tables and figures in one and then do it opposite for the other. Try and stay consistent. It'll help you stay focused on your writing. More importantly, I believe it'll help the reader because they'll follow your path from reading one to the next, and the repetition helps people to understand the work better. Stay consistent in relating to survey populations, such as give the actual number and then the percentage. Let's just say, for example, that you had 18 people. And in one of your themes, you wrote about how 12 people suggested something. Well, perhaps 12 is the equivalent of 60%. Many authors of dissertations tend to give one or the other. I encourage you to give them both, and I encourage you to use this format. Give the number, or if you have to spell out the number because the number is required to be spelled out because perhaps it's the first word in a sentence, or perhaps it's a number that's below 10, but give the number, and then in parentheses give the percentage. This satisfies everybody's need as they look at your work. Keep in mind, some people are numbers orientated while others are percentage-wise orientated. Oftentimes people can see, 60%, because that means, okay, it's more than 50%. And you may already know that 12 is more than 50% in your own work, but keep in mind, the reader of your work years from now is not as in tune or as familiar with your work, and some people like to see the percentages. I do encourage you to have both, and I do encourage you to stay consistent in how you present them. I encourage you also, even if you have 100%, let's just say you had 18 out of 18 people that gave you information, again, use 18 and give 100%. That way they know both. The next item I want to highlight in this wrap-up on the qualitative data in Chapter 4 is highlight any theme not expected. As I mentioned a few slides ago, when you're prioritizing your themes and how you're presenting them, if you have a theme that's not expected, highlight that in your narrative. Whether you present this first of all your themes or it's in prioritization order, I encourage you to sit back and think about your themes and as they relate to the body of knowledge. Now, you're an expert in your area of study. There's no doubt about that. You have been researching, you have been doing the literature review, you have been living in this topic for probably 2 years, maybe even more. Is there a theme that's generated in your research that is not commonly found in the literature that you've been going through or in conversations you've had with other experts? Many times, it's this one theme that is the highlight of your dissertation work. So I encourage you, as you generate the themes and you start to see them unfold as you write them together and your document, or as you write them on paper and you compare them and you're starting to decide how to write your work, if there's any theme that's different, then ensure that you highlight it somehow, some way, so that the reader understands this. I encourage you to have a discussion with your dissertation chair on this matter, because I have seen many dissertations that don't include some sort of highlighting of an unexpected theme, and the value of the dissertation is actually diminished. And some students don't believe that they should highlight something because at first it may seem like, gee, this doesn't align with the literature. I must have done something wrong, or I might have asked the question the wrong way. When in fact, what you may have done is found the one item that was needed the most to fill that gap in the literature, to help people overcome the problems that they're experiencing, which is why you're doing your dissertation in the first place. So just be careful as you put your chapter together and make sure if there's any theme that's worthy of highlighting, do so. The next slide I'd like to talk about here is what's provided in the information with the wrap-up on presenting qualitative data in Chapter 4 is quote survey participants in a consistent manner to support theme generation. What I mean by this is as you introduce your themes, however you're going to cite one survey participant, use the same general format for others. For example, if you're going to say that you have your coding for each person, so you're not using their name, then use the coding, perhaps then with a semicolon, and then give the quotation. Don't do it the other way around next time by giving the quote and then add the person's coding at the end of the quotation. Stay consistent and try to, when possible, keep consistent also. If you're going to quote one author in one or two sentences, see if you can stay consistent at least within the same theme. Because what happens sometimes, I've seen students write their chapter 4 and they quote survey participants, and some put too much information in there. I know you're excited about putting your project together and you want to get it done. You want to put some great information in there, but stay consistent in how you do it, because sometimes more is just more. It's not better. However your approach is in quoting your survey participants, stay consistent in that manner throughout all the themes. Purposely align research questions and problem statement. As you're writing your chapter 4, keep in mind when the data was collected, these themes ideally are designed to produce information to allow one to answer the research questions for the study, which are in support of the problem statement. And of course, the research questions also are born out of the gap in the literature. Oftentimes, you may get feedback or you may hear of others indicating that there's no alignment between Chapter 4 and the research questions and the problem statements. Ideally, you will have information in your themes that relate back to the research questions. Remember, in Chapter 4, you're not going to analyze anything. You're just going to present your data. But you may be presenting data in such a manner which purposely relate back to the research questions. Much like in a quantitative study, as you'll find in the quantitative lessons, what happens is that null hypothesis is tested, and the result of testing that null hypothesis allows one to answer the research question. Here in theme generation, it's similar, except there's no testing of hypotheses, but it still gives evidence to support the research questions and how that question is going to be answered. You will be doing the analysis in Chapter 5, but make sure as you're writing your work that you're keeping your research questions and problem statement in mind and do the tie-ins where it's possible. Explain everything in simple terminology. When you generate a theme, don't feel like you need to use excess jargon that comes from your studies, experts who have answered questions for you. Oftentimes, if you're doing a study, let's just say it's in technology or in healthcare or in the military, some of the experts you interview will give you information in ways that the common reader will not be able to understand. It's up to you to translate the complex outcome of all the data and put it into something simple so the vast majority of people can understand it. Now, I encourage my mentees to write their dissertation, Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, in a manner that anybody with a high school diploma would be able to understand. Because oftentimes the users of your work have just that, a high school diploma. And they may be frontline supervisors, they may even be managers who have not achieved more education yet in their careers. So keep in mind, keep it simple, right? Like I always say with the KISS philosophy, keep it simple, student. Same thing. Make sure that as you put your chapter together, as you review it, that it flows in a very simple manner and the words used reflect well upon the outcome that you're trying to accomplish. Use tables and figures to add value, particularly when you're putting your themes together. I've seen where some people say that there were 7 themes generated, and they'll create a paragraph and they'll say what each theme is and they'll put a comma after each one. And it ends up being a very long sentence. I encourage you not to do that. I encourage you, in that case, to use a table. Now, very infrequently have I seen figures used in Chapter 4, but there have been times where I have seen them in there. I encourage you to build tables where it's appropriate. I do understand that they're not required, and some dissertation chairs and actually some reviewers will ask you not to put a table in there. My personal belief, as I've been explaining through this program, is if you put a table in there, you're going to add more value, particularly for the reader 3 or 4 years from now when they look at your Chapter 4, and it saves them from having to read the entire narrative. Or at least they see the table and it drives them to read the narrative. So consider, where could you use a table and figure? If you can use one for the purpose that it's designed to help present information in a way that's going to add value to your work, please do. Provide enough evidence to suggest meaning. As you present the data, you're still going to have some meaning. Doesn't mean you're going to analyze it. For example, you cannot just say that 12 themes were generated. You have to give enough evidence to suggest meaning of those themes. And that's why you do the quoting from the people that you have interviewed. You have a little bit of narrative of your own. As you present the theme, present the data that supports generating the theme. That's what this is about here. Suggest meaning to create the theme. We do the same thing in quantitative when we do the analysis in a formula, because that formula provides for the testing of a null hypothesis. And when we indicate that the null hypothesis was rejected or failed to be rejected, that suggests meaning. It doesn't analyze anything yet, but it suggests meaning. Make sure as you finalize your Chapter 4, particularly for each theme that you address, that from that in of itself, somebody should be able to walk away saying, I know what that author means. If you do that, you have done your job well. Remember, do not analyze, just present the data. Even with the meaning, it's about presenting the meaning and leaving it at that in this chapter. Don't get into indicating that when 3 themes are generated, what those themes actually mean. You're just going to indicate that these themes were generated, give evidence on how they were generated, and leave it at that. All this analysis part and evaluating of the themes and what they mean individually and collectively will be the value that you're going to add in your Chapter 5. There's no need to cite anything other than survey participants. I really don't see a need for you to cite anybody's work in your Chapter 4. And many university reviewers are indicating there's no reason to cite anybody, because after all, there's nothing to do with your literature review here. There's nothing to do with supporting anything that deals with research. You've done that in Chapter 3. Here, you're just providing the evidence for the theme generation, and that all comes from the survey participants. Now, I'm not going to say there is no need to cite anything other than the survey participants. Absolute. I haven't seen every dissertation in the world, but of all the students I've worked with, and what I believe to be true, there's probably not going to be many instances where you do need to quote or provide any citation from a paraphrase in Chapter 4. What I was able to do in this lesson is give you what I call 14 reminders for presenting qualitative data. I hope as you went through this lesson, perhaps you gained a little bit of a review of the prior lessons on qualitative information, how to present it in your Chapter 4, and perhaps it ingrained and deepened the learning a little bit for yourself. So as you do qualitative work, or as a consumer of qualitative work, even if you're not doing qualitative dissertation work, that you'll understand better when you read different types of qualitative studies, whether it be in a peer-reviewed article or you're engaging in conversation with other peers of yours about research in general. In the lesson strategy, completing lesson number 7, as was just done in this lesson, the next lesson in this series of 12 is lesson 8 of 12, and that's presenting quantitative data, part 1 of 3. In that lesson, I'm going to give general information to help you better understand how to relate to quantitative data in a Chapter 4. Even if you're not using quantitative data in your work in regards to your dissertation, I encourage you still watch the lessons on quantitative data so you learn a little bit more and you're a better consumer of research. This will help you later when you decide perhaps that you want to do some research or you're helping somebody else. Now is the perfect time to add more value to your research. As you go through this lesson strategy, take these ideas of the notes that you're taking and anything else that sounds familiar to you or exciting and helps you to say, how can I develop my own dissertation, Chapter 4, to add more value for the reader? And when you ask that question of yourself, chances are you're going to find areas that you can improve your work. I also encourage you to ask that question of your dissertation chair and committee members. How might I add more value to my Chapter 4 for the unknowable reader? Almost every faculty member will have an answer for you. Then you consider that and decide if and where you can incorporate more value to your own Chapter 4. I appreciate the fact that you allow me to help you get through your dissertation work. I certainly hope that you're finding these lessons helpful. If you have any feedback, please do not hesitate to contact me. And if you find this of value, I ask if you would please do me a favor. I'd be honored if you would share this program with other people as well.